Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Stephen Robinson. I am delighted to have joining me here today for our bonus chat. Uh, Montana-based writer Laramie Dean, very seasonally appropriate as we enter the Halloween season. Writer of horror fiction and plays and creepy stuff, and I'm just very excited to get into it with you here. You have a book coming out. Can you show us? I think you pulled it up on your phone of
Oh
like
yes.
the cover and tell us a bit about the book and
There we go. Ooh, spooky, scary. Yes. I wish I had. It's called Black Forest. I wish I actually had a copy of it. When the author copies come, I plan to cry copious amounts of tears and hug at least one copy and probably take it to bed with me and sleep with it for a while is the plan that I have. But for now, I only have the digital, the
well,
digital version, the digital cover.
congratulations. I'm very excited it's out there. Can you tell folks what the book is about, what it kind of covers and how it fits
Yeah.
into your larger milieu?
I've been a high school teacher for 11 years, and one of the things that I was really intrigued by when I started teaching was how a lot of my students would leave Montana, leave Missoula, where I teach, and go to college somewhere, and then a lot of them would come back. Sometimes after a semester, sometimes after a couple of weeks. And I always thought it was really interesting. And I had fun in college. I loved college. College was great. I was a theater major. There are way worse things to be. And I was really intrigued by the idea of people that struggled in college because I thought it was so much fun. And I wanted to write, I was reading Shirley Jackson's Hangs a Man at the time about a young woman who finds her entire world, her sanity crumbling at university. And I wanted to write about that with a queer character. So Black Forest is about a young man named Nathan who has the uncanny and unfortunate ability to see dead people in a sixth sensian kind of way. And he is having an affair with a so-called straight boy and graduating from high school, and everything seems to be pretty up in the air. And has a seance where everything that could go wrong in a seance goes wrong. And then Nathan goes to college, and instead of just dead people, several boys from the university have gone missing and are reappearing to him as freaky monsters. I did a reading from Black Forest at the Montana Book Festival a couple weeks ago, and I read the section where Nathan is confronted in the campus woods. I went to school in Illinois and we had a campus woods. I feel like everybody should have a campus woods. I read a scene where a giant spider leg comes bursting. Oh, that's cool. Bursting out of the poor dead boy's eye socket. And I was really freaked out by the image of that. Nathan falls in love with a young man named Theo, who may or may not be what he seems, may or may not be human. You'll have to read the book. It's called Black Forest. It's published by Inkshares. It's available wherever fine books are sold.
and
November 1st is the release date.
it's exciting. Right after Halloween, so there's
I know.
still I like
Spooky season.
to.
Although I was explaining to my husband how Christmas used to be the time, especially in England, where it was ghost story season,
Oh yeah.
right? Like, yeah, people would tell ghost stories. There were whole anthologies of creepy Christmas ghost stories. So
What
I
I
just think I'm bringing it back.
Yeah, well, that's what I love about A Christmas Carol because it's essentially a ghost story. One of my favorite. There's also an audio version where Tim Curry does all the characters and reads. I enjoy listening to and so forth. So that type of I think that's a lot of fun. I also love you know because we've talked about sort of the queer themes in a lot of movies, especially like Hitchcock and other things that we
Mm-hmm.
enjoy, and how that kind of and it's interesting because I think we'll get into a common TV show we really love and how that inspires a lot of us. But the queer themes of work can also just sort of, I know for me, is often about, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this, is sort of the idea of isolation, being sort of different and figuring that out, which
Mm-hmm.
of course very much young adult fiction, but even beyond that, I think it's sort of a common thread that sort of often draws you into that. And of course, like creepy houses and just the decaying worlds and stuff like that, I find very fascinating and appealing. I feel like Hitchcock was someone who had a lot of either deliberately or not so, I can't read his mind, but it seemed a lot of queer themes in his work. I mean,
A
obviously,
lot of it
Rope
was
is the most
deliberate,
overt,
yeah.
but like clearly there. So you think very much deliberate in
Oh
yours,
yeah, Rope, absolutely deliberate. I
obviously.
just finished a book called the 12 Lives of Alfred Hitchcock, where it doesn't go chronologically. The author, and I can't remember the author's name, um, separates him by these different types of person or personality, and talks a lot about queer themes and queer, but deliberate. Like I would say, Rope is about the two gay men that murder their friend at the beginning, and then Jimmy Stewart figures it out. But even like Psycho, where of course it seems kind of offensive and goofy now, where
Mhm.
sorry, spoiler alert for a 60-year-old movie. Uh, some people are very sensitive about that.
Yeah.
Where Norman Bates appears, and the last time I showed his Psycho to one of my classes, they laughed when Norman Bates appears at the end in the dress and
Mhm.
the wig, and I mean, drag is often funny, and I can actually see it a little
That's
bit
the
where
complex, and that's the complexity, right? Because it's sort of
yeah,
I don't. I think that even there's a weird moment at the end. It's not. They distinctly say that he does not believe he's a woman. He's not going to try. He's trying to become his mother, but not in the sense of I believe I'm a woman. It's very, in a way, it is weird and awkward. He's not, you know, it's not becoming something more beautiful or trying to
right.
make himself something more beautiful or whatever, um, or to fulfill his true self. It's actually, in a weird way, going in the closet in a sense
Mm.
by becoming his mother because he's trying to escape his own desires or urges by becoming her.
Oh
And he
yeah, I mean he
so,
can't stand being Norman Bates. He can't stand having these impulses, these desires, these feelings that uh, his mother has said are bad. So he has to, yeah, he literally has to become someone else. And it is, and I think Hitchcock found a lot of things funny that maybe other people wouldn't think were humorous. So I don't know, maybe it was intentional, but it's definitely an uncomfortable moment. But yeah, he there's a lot of queerness in Hitchcock, and multiple identities, in Vertigo, God help us, the dark-haired twin. And if you follow me on Instagram,
oh
I
yeah.
have a thing for blonde actresses who put on a dark-haired wig and then become somebody else.
Yeah, Vertigo. I think Vertigo and Rope compete for my favorite Hitchcock film. Vertigo is just astonishing. I remember being blown away like almost 20 so years ago when it was re-released finally. It was one of the missing Hitchcock films for a while. And it's astonishing. And I think plenty of it came up to me because at the time had been a longtime fan of the show Dark Shadows, and I was watching this. I was like, oh well, this is clearly what they were doing when they introduced the
Mhm.
character. Like for those who watch the show, there's a storyline where the vampire Barnabas Collins is trying to recreate his lost dead love, literally remaking her, dressing her to try to make her this way. It's a very oh wow, that's and this is a show that often riffed on what was then often not so late shows. It's very meta in a sort of Tarantino way, right? Like very much this is all the stuff we process. We're going to put our own spin on it. But yeah, I mean, we're both fans of the show Dark Shadows. I always state this with Dark Shadows. When I remember my wife first came to my apartment in New York, and one of the things she sees, she just like looks around and very like deadpan. It's like, well, what's Dark Shadows, and why is there like 26 of them? Because as for though there's over 1,000 episodes, and before streaming or whatever, even with DVD volumes, it's a huge investment of
There's
time
so
and
many
money that's
episodes.
right there. So it's just a weird thing that anyone would have, especially like more than 50
Uh,
years ago. Like all this, it's like such a, and it wasn't like judgmental. She was just very curious
what is
by this
this?
whole thing. Like there's a lot of, and we've talked about how I'd mentioned on Twitter as a fan of the show, it's been about 30 years since the Sci-Fi Channel debuted, and the Sci-Fi Channel that started showing the episodes and
Twice
at
a
least
day. Two
twice a day.
episodes a day.
And what I'd realized was a lot of those episodes had not aired since the late 60s, early 70s. I think there was because it's a big investment to
Mhm.
re-air them. So Sci-Fi had really invested, and I was watching them. And people are like, how could you have possibly watched something all the way through 1,000 episodes, not just once, but twice, and frankly enough that you're quoting it randomly, so you've watched it a lot. And it is this weird, I think Danny Horn, who ran a blog called Dark Shadows Every Day, referred to a
Oh,
ritual. And
R.I.P.
there is a sense of a ritual of watching the show,
Yeah.
of like process going through it, seeing the episodes. Um, but I've it's a strange way people, might talk about sort of the camp appeal or whatever. And there's certainly some of that. And we could talk about, if you like, some of it's the queer things in that series as well, because it was very controversial in the 90s to ever go online and talk about queer themes in Dark Shadows. People get very upset.
How God forbid you mention that Jonathan Frid was a flaming homosexual, or
No,
Louis Edmonds or Joel Crothers. Yeah.
there were sort of the fans who would prefer that he was just a lonely man who never date. Like, I was like,
So
that's
sad.
no, he
Oh,
was just a very shy, lonely man who died
yes.
alone. It's
Yes.
like,
His
okay, well,
favorite, what
that's
is that
really
article?
better
His
than,
favorite woman is his mother, I think, was one of those
yeah,
magazine articles from the 60s.
which of course is just very coded. And I think stuff that's coded, I've always found fascinating. I remember in the mid early 90s, whenever the celluloid closet came out, and just the
Yeah.
depth of like what was in the movies under the surface, um was always fascinating. Because if you like examining text and writing things as has that, it was just sort of, that was the fun thing. And I think a lot of queer writers and a lot of writers in general were sort of, here's this little thing that we can put into something, or even arguably just queer culture, like the ways that characters interact or connect with each other is is right there. And I think Dark Shadows was a show that there's a lot of, I found great writers. One of my favorite is Violet Wells.
Mm.
And she, I mean, I always would know at the time, I could know it was an episode
You
of
hear
her,
the
how she
dialogue.
wrote the dialogue. And that was something. So let's talk about this for a bit, because you're a playwright as well. I've written play, I felt that she was someone up. Finding
My
Joe,
new play.
Little Women, yes.
My new play. Oh yeah, and for Dark Shadows fans, classic. Yeah.
Yes, and I'd love to hear more about how you've produced those, but I felt like there was something, the dialogue, the rhythm, so it wasn't just kind of spooky moments, but it was just like really like cool
You
scenes that
know,
are sharp
and
and witty.
you mentioned Dark Shadows Every Day, where I'm such a huge Danny Horn fan, and I actually have used a lot of what he says. The make a friend, make a joke, make a plot point happen. I keep that in mind when I'm introducing characters, or when I'm talking about writing with my students. And Violet Wells, plot wasn't so much her thing, but I feel like she's responsible for. She's the Angelique out of the fireplace. All those great lines of dialogue when Angelique the Witch comes back in 1887. But was she the one that wrote the thing about the line that Kampatofi says about, "Do I care how many leaves are on the
Oh
tree? Do
yeah,
I?"
that's a
That,
classic.
it's just some really fun dialogue,
Yeah,
especially for this.
she's very specific. Yeah, and it's a lot of great which soaps have. Like, it's like really cool moments, real cool
Mhm.
dialogue. But she especially, I mean, it that sort of, like Shakespearean riffs, but just also often like people reading each other. Essentially, I mean, Louis Absence was no matter what characters plays, could do it so well.
Right.
I've often, like his line about, I think, rubbish. Everyone in the house knew you were carrying on with that woman. Even the servants knew it. And if they know something, it's bound to be
Everyone knows
true.
that.
It's just
Well, you
the
don't have
way.
Louis Edmonds around and not give him good, shady dialogue.
Yeah. And, I always found that people would talk about what's an inspiration of yours. And I would go back to that. And it's not beyond, it was just, you know, the dialogue, the cleverness in the dialogue, and also just how to write, epic stuff with two people sometimes, or three
Hmm.
people. Only have so many actors per day, and you need to make this. They filmed it live
Right.
live on tape most of the time. So it's sort of the idea of where, okay, well, this scene needs to lead. There often be moments where you could hear the person running to be in the next scene, the next shot. So you're kind of learning like how to keep something going, the momentum. So it was a show that I found and I still find entertaining and inspirational in that way. Um, and of course, some great, characters: Grayson Hall's Julia Hoffman, and of course, Lara Parkus Angelique, who's just such a compelling, fascinating character. A lot of fun. So that that's something I presume is you've found into your own work, into your own ways of finding lines and ways to sort of do.
Yeah.
But
I and I've actually only seen the whole show once all the way through during the pandemic. I was like, hey, this is available. It's on Tubi, it's on Amazon Prime, and I had so much more time, even teaching. I had so much more time that I was like, hey, I mean, and there were days where I would watch 12, 13 episodes a day, which now I go back and go, oh my God, the weather was, not only was the world shut down, but the weather in Missoula, Montana was particularly vengeful in the spring of 2020. So it was a lot of me on the couch feeling absolutely depressed and like giant chunks of the show. So I've seen the show all the way through once, and I've seen my favorite storylines and episodes several times. And they work their way into conversations. There's some great lines of dialogue you can say to people. I always tell people to end a conversation with, I am, say your name, and I hate you.
yes, wonderful line too. Like just such a cool love. Yes.
Well, it is. And I'm a theater actor. I was trained to be a theater actor, not film or television, and you can probably tell just by talking to me. And so one of the reasons I love that show too is it's so theatrical, right? It's all these New York theater people and New York playwrights and uh, churning out an insane show at an insane pace, and everyone just kind of went along with it, and then it blew up and became a phenomenon. And um, not last spring, but the spring before, when we had gone back to no, it was 2 springs ago, we had gone back to school, and we couldn't do live performance. We couldn't have people into the theater to watch, but the kids wanted to do, and I teach high school, and the kids wanted to do something. And we were doing all these radio shows. There's all these radio scripts hanging around. We did The Uninvited. We did some Superman. Um, and then I said, hey, you guys, how do you feel about a soap opera with vampires, witches, werewolves, and time travel? And they were like, we love it. So I took all the 1795 scripts and turned them into a two-part um, a two-part adaptation that we recorded. We rehearsed. We recorded like a radio play, and then we got together and did if you look at the photographs, so there's a group of photographs, the kids are all distanced, and we did costumes. I had a girl who appeared one day and said, hey, I can do latex makeup. I can do latex horror makeup. Do you need anything? And I was like, well, I need several characters with their eyeballs falling out. And she said, I'm on it. We did the Ghost of Jeremiah, and we did the whole 1795 storyline. I had a kid that sounded very much like Barnabas. I had a Bayesian kind of coat. One of my students, oh, look at this. She made this little Barnabas cane. She made a ring. And then we did these photo shoots, and it was really fun, and the kids got into it. And I think that it was really a special time. And the dialogue it's good dialogue. People
Very
think
good
soap opera
dialogue.
is,
A
it's
lot of
great
great,
dialogue.
a lot of great
It's and it,
stuff.
and it is
And
it's very Shakespearean. You talk to
oh
people
yeah,
about that particular storyline. It's all tragedy, 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 tragedy,
it's
with
one
some
of the
really great
tightest
roles
of
for
the.
women.
It's very the tightest of the of the tragic kind of storyline. Almost sort of the hitting every note of everyone winds up dead at the end. The destructive figure, the four, Angelique is kind of your Iago or Richard III type character, but very facet of what she wants, what she's willing to do to get it. Barnabas is kind of clueless in certain
Naive,
ways. Becomes
kid.
naive character who gets his errors is sort of his own naivete, being sort of careless with the feelings of others, and then it ending this way. I think George Lucas would perhaps try to recreate certain concepts of that with the idea of like you know this villain, this badass. You've previously been introduced to this badass villain, so with Darth Vader in that case, and we're going to show you when he's kind of a whiny little boy, and he actually then becomes this villain you've always wanted to see.
Yeah.
And I think that's what kind of happened. Where no, you've been used to at this point the Barnabas Collins character is this very scary, in control character. Now you're seeing him human and kind of gullible and weak, and then you slowly see him become that. That's very compelling. There's wonderful stuff between Jonathan Frid as Barnabas and Louis Edmonds as his father,
Oh,
Jeremiah.
yeah.
It's very, again, I've had friends who say it's like this is so clear, who can speak from experience, the idea of having for them what was viewed as this horrible secret. Your father doesn't really understand, but then realizing he
No, and then he
understands
shoots you. It's every
yeah,
gay man's fear. You come out
yeah,
to your dad and he's like, sorry, son, I love you, but
yeah, yeah,
he
it is.
shoots you.
And then the most I can do is to closet you, like centrally lock you. I don't, and it's
Literally.
it's oh my god, and it's one of those things where it's right here. Is it deliberate? Is it someone making? But I mean, that's the sort of thing with art, right? It's not
Yeah.
necessarily a treatise or outline of here are my themes. Granted, I've worked with young writers who here are my themes. It's like, oh yeah, it's not going to go out well when it's that didactic,
Right.
um but here that was very sort of compelling, and it's it's interesting because again in the 90s you would go online and would try to discuss any of that stuff. There would be this sort of backlash of anyone wanting to imagine that there was any sort of queer themes in these
Mm-hmm.
stories or even literature or any type of literature in general. I think that's been a sort of a challenge now. Like, so you're a teacher and we're in obviously very strange times. You're a teacher. You're a married queer teacher in
Missoula,
Montana.
Montana. And I am so, I'm really fortunate. And I say this all the time. I'm really lucky to teach at the school that I teach. Our principal is fantastic. He's so supportive. He's very open-minded. Um, my husband is the technical director for our theater program at school. So he builds the sets and he does the lights. And I don't say to the kids, "Oh, here's my roommate, here's my friend," which is what people would do once upon a time. And it has never been a problem.
Yeah.
Uh, and I don't know. I mean, I came out when I was 15 I went to the high school that I teach at, high school, and I came out and people were like, "Well, yeah." one of those, one of those people that I don't know if I was ever in. I don't think I ever really
Mhm.
pretended.
And
Otherwise,
so just to clarify for folks watching, you were not straight until one of your groomer teachers mentioned the word gay and said,
no.
"Oh, here's this. We're going to study Oscar Wilde," and suddenly you're gay. Like,
I was actually bitten by another homo under the light of the nearly full moon, and then ever
yes.
since then, there's
It was
you
like
know.
it. Well, it's like the Texas school shootings. They didn't have the doors closed. So the doors didn't allow the vamp to get in, and that tragically.
Right.
So we're trying. It's almost gallows humor because this is real people's
Well,
lives and real serious
yeah, and
stuff.
look where
When
we
you
are,
hear this
though. I mean,
rhetoric, it's scary.
if you don't, oh my God, I was whistling past the graveyard, right? I mean, I don't know how else to exist in this world anymore. And it's funny because after the pandemic, in a post-Trumpian world, well, let's say post-Trump, I think we're still in a fairly
Trumpian,
Trumpian
yes.
world. Yeah. Um, and Missoula is like a bubble. It's like a little oasis in the middle of Montana. I mean, Missoula is not representative of the rest of Montana. I grew up in a really small farming community in northeastern Montana, and it was hard. It was really hard. And I'm friends with a few of the people from my graduating class who moved and went away. Um, and married people of color and are now super liberal, not staying in our little town of Montana. And so I am very well aware that Montana is not super liberal place to be. So I'm really fortunate to be at the school that I'm at, to teach in the town that I'm at, to be allowed to talk about the things that I talk about. I mean, I'm a little nervous about the book coming out, to be perfectly honest. I'm a little nervous. It's there are scenes of sexual congress between dudes, and I don't know how some people are going to react to that. I did do a one-person show called Other Natural in New York City when I was 30, and my parents came to see it, and it was something I had worked on in my PhD, solo queer performance, and it was a lot about why I like monsters, why I like horror fiction, and how that has kind of impacted my queer identity. And I also talked a lot about first times. And you have never lived until you have performed a one-person show in New York City while your parents are watching you talking about the first time that you hooked up with a guy. There are so few things are scary after that. I'm like, hey, I did this thing. So uh yeah, it's I'm fortunate to be who I am, where I am, and working with the people that I'm lucky to work with, I think.
Yeah, and the and the plays and I mean, because that's all the stereotypes, right? Like you take going to theaters. Oh, you're taking these kids in theater class and introducing, God forbid, that they're queer themes in Dracula. I mean,
Right.
again, this is one of those things that's right on the page. Can you tell us a bit about your version of Dracula that you did and how you did it for in a high school
Yeah.
environment?
Yeah, and for high school kids, because it's tricky, it's sexy. There's sex in Dracula. I mean, talking about Dark Shadows and all the queer stuff there, they never would let one guy bite another guy in the neck. Like Barnabas bit women like crazy, and it was not even subtle. Um, who played Eve? Who played Megan?
Oh
Marie
yeah,
Wallace.
Marie
Yeah, Marie
Wallace.
Wallace is like literally on the bed, writhing in anticipation, waiting for Barnabas to come and get her. So I was aware of that and thinking, okay, how am I gonna handle this? And it's pre-pandemic. It was easier, I think, to do romantic things. Like we did Our Town, and there's the big kiss in Our Town. I mean, like, there's kissing, and they're high school kids, and they're nervous about it. And since the pandemic, it's been harder. When we did Little Women last year, we did it with transparent masks, so there could be no. I mean, even hugging was. We didn't even
Hmm.
have characters hug. So Dracula, I had done an adaptation in 2004 that I called Big Gay Dracula, and I wrote it for I was a grad student at the University of Montana at the time, and I was teaching playwriting and taking education classes, and they kind of let me do whatever I wanted. And I was like, hey, I have this big gay version of Dracula, can I stage it? And they said yeah. And we did it for Gay Pride in June 2004, and it was fun, and people came and watched it. And I will never forget. I take the Harker character in Dracula, and of course I smoosh them together. And Dracula bites Harker, and the lights go out, and the lights come back, and there's this coffin, and the vampire hunters open the coffin, and here's Harker inside of it. And some poor audience member, this lovely gentleman, went, "Oh no!" I was like, "It's theater. It's okay. He's fine. He's really okay. He's gonna come back in a little bit. Don't worry about it." So when a friend of mine had approached me several years ago now to write Dracula for her, and then her school thought it would be too bloody, and so they did Macbeth instead. And I was like, well, hey, I'll write it for myself. So I wanted to focus on what is evil, what does it mean to be evil, and what is Dracula's big goal? Is it to come and suck his way through England? Does he have a talent? Is it like a talent scout, an evil talent scout, where he can find evil inside you and bring it out? So that's kind of the route that I went. And I mean, I've been writing Dracula adaptations since I was 7, because that's the kind of amazing child I was.
But, well, and that might have been, I mean, maybe a little, but like the Francis Ford Coppola version, so it was almost 30
It's
years ago.
30 this year.
Yeah,
Oh.
I remember seeing this in college, and it
Mm-hmm.
was ridiculous, but in funny way. Like even Keanu Reeves kind of going in and out of accent,
Oh.
and the stuff was
Oh.
sort of, but like the hair is a set designer's dream, or even
Oh, and the
costume designing,
costumes. I mean,
hair,
Aiko Yashoka won the
hair and the stuff. It's just
yeah.
nuts. And
But
you saw,
Dracula has that unfortunate giant butt on his head, and I don't know
yeah,
any way around that.
but it's absurd. It's like it's Dracula by Isaac Mizrahi, which I think is a wonderful thing. I love Isaac Mizrahi. But that was what you're watching. You're like, oh my god, this is just this is just so crazy and over the top. And I know that was one of the things. When talking about Dark Shadows, folks will always sort of, oh, it's cheap, or oh, it's this, and it would get that would sort of get on my nerves because I'm someone who's worked in mid-sized theaters. I'm sure you have as
Mhm.
well. And there is an art form. It's not like this play and this production, this mid-sized theater, would be automatically better in a arena with
Right.
tons more money and tons more stuff. And so often you get what I feel like the beautiful old house parlor on Dark Shadows, which is clearly just a room. It's no bigger than my parlor, and I'm obviously not from a
A
wealthy name,
Collins.
but the way it was dressed, set, designed, you believed what was happening. It was these wonderful moments are happening in this movie, even though apparently the door to the basement in this mansion is like 2 steps away from the fire, so it's absurd, but it works. And I think
Yeah.
often there's the idea of like, oh well, let's put it in a bigger and bigger mansion. I think other adaptations have done it, and that it's looked, I would say, cold, because then
Yeah. Well, I
it's
mean, the
just a big
91
house.
series. And I know that you and Danny discussed the 91 series. I have a really special place in my heart for it because I was 12 when it debuted, and I had known what Dark Shadows was. I have I have this amazing videotape. I hope I still have it somewhere that has American Werewolf in London, Silver Bullet, and this single episode of Dark Shadows. The Barnabas isn't even in, but it's one of the black and white ones. And I think David sneaks into the old house and the doors slam behind him, and then
Mhm.
the dogs start howling. That freaked the hell out of me when I
Oh
was a kid.
yes,
So freaky. And for years, I had no idea how it ended. And I would go to Walden Books, and I would sit and I would read the episode summaries in the Dark Shadows tribute book and try to figure out. They were like episode storyline missing. I was like, that's not
it was
acceptable.
very like it was just very, both the music and the camera work and what they could do in a very sense. um
Yeah.
I have fond memories of the 91 series as well. It's interesting, it aired right before shows like, say, Melrose Place. It was a year before Melrose Place, so it's a
Right.
sense of where it was kind of, it wasn't necessarily Dynasty, and it wasn't sort of 1990s too
Was a
craziness.
weird place to
So you, in
be.
a weird way, it was kind of like, oh well, you're actually, the 1990s Angelique was Marsha Cross as Kimberly a few years later. Like, it's that kind of madness that you weren't really
Yeah.
getting on that show at the time. But at the same time, especially for you youngsters out there, when there's no DVD or no streaming, it's like, this is Dark Shadows. It's back, and it's only, airs, and it's never going to come back again. There was something very precious and rare about it.
Yeah.
And it was something I watched with my late mother, because she was one of the original, like, a huge fan
Run
of the
home from
show.
school
Yeah.
fans. Yeah.
So she was in high school and originally aired, to the point where when it was airing in syndication in the late 80s, she was like, "Oh, this is airing. You'll love this." And we would so she brought me into it.
Well,
She
and
was
if you
always
are a
like,
fan of Universal horror movies, especially I think if you're a fan of Universal horror
"Oh
movies,
yeah.
like 1897 is a
Oh yeah."
Universal horror
I
movie.
always come back to that. It's just sort of, it's universal. It's on a Universal horror lot. There's the unfortunate. I always sort of like, I wish it would just sort of get away from the unfortunate basing gypsies, quote unquote, on
Oh,
real people, and just make them Klingons or something. Like, just basically, these are Klingons with magic powers to curse you, but we're not basing this on real, actual people who've been persecuted, because that's
right.
bad. But like, because it is, you might as well, there is as much chance of having Klingons in 19th century Maine as there was roaming bands of gypsies. It's like, I gotta go
Gypsies.
find the head. I'm gonna go find the head gypsy in Boston. It's like, what? One of the Kennedys? I want him to come back with a Kennedy accent, or like one of the,
Boston.
yeah.
Maybe that's how people in Boston sound. I have never been. Maybe that's how. Well, and you know what's so funny is I'm listening to I just finished reading the Witching Hour, the Mayfair Witches books by Anne Rice, and found on eBay for like $2 the original audiobooks that like Tim Curry is narrating. It's funny you mentioned Tim Curry is narrating the one that I'm listening to now, and they talk about gypsies. And Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which I guess now is 25, so it's also of its time and it's a relic, but it has the same tropes. It's like, here are gypsies and they have this accent. I mean, Uncle Janos who talks like this, whatever that is. I don't know what accent I'm doing right now. It's not a real
Well,
accent.
it's one of those things of where it's hard to, you know, not to feel bad for people, what, but it's like you wouldn't know that they're real people. Something to remind you they're real people. You just think that they are like the Catholic universal horror. It's like, well, oh, even like discovering that Frankenstein was a real species
Right.
of person. It's like, oh wow. I mean, maybe you could try to depict Frankenstein more politely because it's a real race of people. Or like Gypsy just felt like absurd, like in Stephen King and,
Yeah.
and Thinner and others.
Oh, I
Other
forgot about that.
yes, the
It's the
poison
same
pie.
thing.
One of the best endings of a book, the poison pie. My God, it blew up. Anyone, please read Thinner. I think this is one of his scariest books. Really, and
So gross
impressive.
and so gross, but so
Yeah,
Greek. That is so Greek, and again Shakespeare. Like that's
and just tragic, which I think that's what makes very good horror. But
yeah.
yeah, what going back 'cause your husband has a set design. What I love the set design on Dark Shadows. I felt like none of that was cheap, and I think it was done, and it was and the colors when they went from black and white, it
Mm.
was perfect gothic kind of that style, and then went into color, and then shortly after going to color, going back to something like all these beautiful
Oh
gowns
right.
and outfits from the 18th century, which is crazy. It's like, okay, well, yeah, we're no longer in the present day, and we're going to put women in these beautiful gowns.
And are we
Maybe
ever going back? We don't know.
yeah.
Here's Laura
So
Parker.
as someone who does I mean, it's I that's what's drawn me. I mean, and I've done a lot of immersive theater, and I like that sense of being in the space. I remember when someone had asked, at some point it came up, oh, what's your favorite Hitchcock film? And it's one of those things where it's, oh, Rope, actually, or Vertigo. It's like Rope. It's like, of course, Rope is the most I could play. And
Yeah,
here to
yeah.
this, I
Well,
just
and I ask
love
my
how it
students all the
moves.
time, why should live theater continue to exist? What can live theater accomplish that film and television don't already do really, really well, right? So, and by necessity, my space, I share it with choir, orchestra, and band, and they're always having concerts, and that's fantastic. I'm really good friends with all the performing arts teachers at Hellgate, but it's a challenge. Like, okay, well, what can we do? Also, I'm not a set designer, and my husband is self-taught. So a lot of it's like, here are some platforms and we're going to paint these things. And we did the Little Mermaid last spring, which was fun, but I'm talking about Disney with my classes these days. Uh, but the set was a few platforms and we painted some flats, this beautiful green and blue color. And then my husband got some cool light, some gobos and some gels, and it was pretty and it was fun. And I feel like the focus should be more on the story and the characters anyway.
And
So
it lets you do that in the drama and the stance and being in the space. So I've done a sort of the other where there's like, I just love the idea of where you could pull back a drawer and it's like now go into this room and
mhm.
stuff's happening and that's really fun. And Rope, especially, you feel like you're in that party, kind of wondering with them. Um, what is interesting there, because I'm sure you're familiar with the sort of unfortunate trope of killing your gaze, right? So the idea
Yep.
of trying to kill it. And so
Bury your gaze. Got to be
what was
buried.
an interesting twist is the overtly hetero character in Rope is killed at the beginning of the play. And I don't know, you probably are aware of this. I don't know if this has ever occurred before. I discovered it and I've tried to find this ever example of this. So the murder victim in Rope obviously is killed, screams at the beginning of it. It's never heard from again. He's, they
He's
serve
boxed.
boxed. But the trailer for Rope is a scene of David, the victim, and his fiance, girlfriend, and they're in the park and they're like, having a cute little scene, and he goes off to then, of course, go get killed. He's about to go meet the killers, and it then cuts to Jimmy Stewart. that was a lot. I'm gonna do a bad Jimmy. You can't say any Jewish. You're just impossible. It's like a reflex. It was like that was the last time she saw that boy alive, and um, and it's like wow, like he's not in a movie, he's in a trailer, which was played in movies, but he's not in this movie.
Right.
It's such a cool Hitchcock thing to do.
Well, you've seen the trailer, the Psycho trailer, right? Where Hitchcock leads everyone through
Yeah, it's
the.
hilarious. It's like he's just kind of leading people around and like, oh, man, and here.
Here's where I do a terrible Hitchcock. Here's where one of the murders happened. He fell down the stairs and the knife came up. No, let's go to the bathroom now.
Oh, it's just I don't want to even tell the story. It's like so very British about it, just very kind of cool. Another thing that I found very inspirational, storytelling about Rope is this 80 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
but not real. It makes you feel. So if you watch it again, clearly a whole dinner passes, people leave, people come back, there's confrontation. In your mind, it's been at least 3 or 4 hours, right? But it's done in just 80 minutes, and it's done through very clever, like people sit down with food, start to eat, and then the food goes away. So we think they've had a full dinner, right? And it's the dialogue has made us not realize they haven't really eaten. And then the dessert's served, there's drinks, it's whatever. He accelerated the setting of the sun. It's like a beautiful set piece behind, and he accelerates that. So it's a magic trick. I'm someone who loves magic tricks, and especially the way you can do that on theater, because it's not CGI, right? You've got to do it in front of the audience to make them believe this has occurred. And it fools the audience every time because he accelerates the setting of the sun. So what it looks like it's about 4 o'clock, and then like it's clearly as dark as 10 on a summer's day or something, but it's been 80 minutes, and it's just so cleverly done. So it's something that I'm
gonna have to go back and look for that now, because I've only seen Rope once or twice, and my husband got me like a lovely Hitchcock set of Blu-rays for Christmas several years ago, and Rope is one of them. So speaking of like fun tricks and cool tricks, when I did, and I used this again when we did Dracula at Hellgate, but when I was doing Big Gay Dracula 2004, and I was 25 and stupid and was an actor. It was the first show I'd ever directed. I didn't know anything about stagecraft really. I hired someone to make a big bat puppet. I wanted Dracula to turn into a giant 8-foot bat or a 6-foot bat or something ginormous. And I hired this puppeteer to be a puppet. And she kept saying she would do it and saying she would. And then she quit showing up at production meetings, and I never heard from her again. And I was like, okay, well, the show opens in a week, and I need me a giant bat. So I did this is my favorite thing I've ever done under pressure theatrically. The actor playing Dracula was already like 6'2" or 6'3". He was a tall boy. I went to a hardware store and I bought some flashlights this big, cut out some red gel, taped them or glued them to the flashlights. Our set was really just curtains and flats. And Van Helsing raises the cross. Dracula goes, backs up, puts his hands down. The lights go out. Stagehand hands in the flashlights. He holds them up. So now it's like 8 feet, 9 feet tall, turns the lights on at the same time. We have a sound effect that I think was like the rending of metal and a Tyrannosaurus Rex roaring. So it was like, and then the actor with the flashlights was like giant red eyes, kind of swooped them down and then turned them off and disappeared outside of the curtain. The lights came back. So it was, the easiest thing in the world. There was no bat or flashlights, gels. And it was the coolest thing. And it was always such a neat effect. And the audience loved it. It was so simple. That's very Dark Shadows too, right? Like necessity is the mother of something.
Well, and it's very simple, and it does feel as if, there's still the magic trick that occurs when you go into a movie theater and you're watching something on screen, but there is something about when it's right in front of you and they do it, and I feel the audience loves that.
That's why live theater will never die. People are always, oh, the theater is dying. I'm like, no, $500 tickets for shows are dying. Like, people love live theater. Are you kidding me? People love it.
Well, theater, sports is theater and people still go. So what you're saying is that your boring play no one wants to see. Of course not. And if you just believe that what you do is, God forbid you do a genre story like Dracula, or God forbid you do a
Right.
slapstick comedy, because there's an unfortunate period where a lot of classic farce, occasionally you will get to see noises off or something, but generally classic farce they wouldn't touch, because it's like, oh, just watch Frasier, and it's like, well, yes, Frasier's good, but also people would love to see very well done farce slaps, comedy on
Yeah,
stage.
I mean, that's why
People love
people
that.
bring Tartuffe back all the time for that reason.
Yeah.
Like, people love Tartuffe. They love it. And someone wrote
And
a really fun
yeah,
rhyming version of it a while ago. That was a great translation. Was it very Dr. Seuss? It might have been kind of Dr. Seuss, but I don't know. It was fun. People love it.
I think that's the karma of it, and like a lot of, as fans of us, of like fans of horror and sci-fi and superhero stories and stuff like that. I think people love big stakes, right? It doesn't mean that you can't. So, and it's the Rod Serling in me, right? Because I think Rod Serling's a big influence on myself, and I find that it's kind of like, yeah, well, coming out of the pandemic, I know you want to tell, because during the pandemic there was obviously a plague, and then there was like um racial unrest in the streets, and then there's whatever. But you know, people don't necessarily want those stories to be sort of hit over the head with a kind of very
Right.
straight version of it. Sometimes you do want to, okay, well, how can we make Ron DeSantis a Marvel villain, or how can we make him a Dark Shadows villain? And then, and because that becomes a way of, in a weird way, coping. I mean, isn't that what all the folktales were? Like,
Yeah.
you, God forbid what happened. You turned off the dark, rabbits and bears. It was dark in the woods, and you weren't safe, right? So you wanted those stories of, in a weird way, it was like the gallows humor. These stories of kind of
In
people who
control, you have some
survive.
control over it, right? If you can make a
Absolutely.
monster, you can come up with ways to kill the monster, right? There's easy ways. You just get you a silver bullet, or get you a wooden stake, or plunge this into the grave. And there's always these solutions so that we have some kind of control over our, if the pandemic has taught us nothing else, uncontrolled,
Well,
uncontrollable
and
lives.
control is a good idea. And I think someone was point you made, because someone was talking about one part, and I said, like, part of what the more successful was, that they have to be, in a weird way, an off ramp, so that the audience will feel okay watching everyone die, because it has to be, oh, well, yeah, you probably shouldn't have moved into the house on the Indian burial ground. Bad on you. You know, I would have moved as soon as I saw the blood, like, these off ramps. And so sometimes people have done, and I've seen people deliberately say, oh, I'm going to write it without the off ramps. Like, isn't that scarier? And it's like, well, no, but then no one wants, then they feel like it's like, here's a story of how someone's baby died and it could happen to you. And it's like, well, no one really wants to be confronted with that. They do want that
Yeah.
control. They do want an idea of like, okay, well, you went into the woods, but the old folksy old lady, the old black person you kind of laughed at, right? So that character, don't go in those, well, make sure you get out of there by something, right? The warning that they ignore. And then it happens, because you then it's like, okay, well, because this is now about your arrogance and your foolishness. And I think that was always kind of a core of Rod Serling's work. Also, someone's arrogance or hubris is what dooms
Mhm.
them, rather than just having someone come on and here's all these horrible things that happened to them. Ba, ba, ba.
Right. When
And
I tried to write about when the pandemic was happening, and I was actually having this conversation with a friend of mine today, and I thought, oh, I have all this time to write now. I have all this time to write. And I was totally, totally frozen. I kept trying things and trying things. And I tried to write this vampire novel that I've been trying to figure out for 20 years. And I was like, oh, I'll make it about the pandemic. And that did not go so well for me. I was like, I don't want to. I'm not a fan of post-apocalyptic fiction anyway, and I was like, I'm living in an apocalypse right now, and Buffy's not obviously going to show up to fix anything, and we just have to get through this. So I think I prefer my lessons, my real life problems that I had to deal with in real life, wrapped up in monsters and genre stuff. That was the panel that I participated in the Montana Book Festival a couple weeks ago.
oh,
Was the state of the genre? It was really a real general sort of idea, but I was lucky enough to be with two other fantastic writers, and one of them writes queer stuff and the other one writes queer stuff and I write queer stuff, and we were all talking about like how we're kind of the redheaded stepchildren of this festival where it's very literary and whatever that means. I don't even really know what literary fiction means. People throw that term all around and I'm like, is it well written? My favorite writing, really, this is why I love Shirley Jackson particularly, because I can spot a Shirley Jackson story from a mile away, like her use of
Mhm.
semicolons, her use of adjective or adverbs, uh, the setup for the story. Like the woman has a clear and identifiable style. And as problematic as Hitchcock was, same deal. As problematic
Mhm.
as Tim Burton is, same deal. They have an identifiable style that resonates with me somehow, and I enjoy it. Hitchcock, especially. When we went to my husband and I went to San Francisco for our 10th anniversary this summer, and we went to Bodega Bay because you can't be a Hitchcock fan and be in San Francisco and not
Absolutely
go to
not.
Bodega Bay.
That
I
too.
tried to go to the Argosy bookshop, but it was closed. The
Yeah.
bookshop that inspired
Well,
Pop Liebel's bookshop in Vertigo, it was closed.
and it's very interesting because the idea of literary fiction for versus, as you were saying, what's well done. Because Hitchcock is again someone who inspired me, and I learned a lot. I just kind of go back because the way he sets up character and story, and it's kind of like you can really learn a lot from just
Mm-hmm.
how you just go in, how he advances the story. Like, okay, this happens within a quarter of the, because I'm sure as you if you teach writing, like this needs to happen by a quarter. The key event has to
Yeah.
happen at this point. He has just put it in, show people clearly how people make choices, how he sort of the idea of the wrong man. So it feels like someone is thrown into a situation without their control, but they are making choices, right? So it
Mm-hmm.
looks as if they are just hapless, but they are making choices that advances it. I mean, and he sets up characters so well. So North by Northwest, when Cary Grant enters, and within 5 minutes, you like the guy. Like he's nice to his secretary, he's charming, he's whatever,
It's
and
funny.
he likes his mom. He's funny, saying joke friend, plot
Joke
point,
friend, make a plot point, make a
and then you're
plot point
right.
happen.
And
Yeah,
then
I get.
the random event that occurs and that dooms him is for trying to be nice. I did something. Oh, I screwed up and gave my secretary bad advice. Wrong information. I need to make that right, and that is what sets up the story, which comes from a good intention. So how can you are sort of going to root for the guy because of it. So it's interesting how he sort of does that, and but to as we sort of wind down here, I mean it would feel so frustrating to me to try to teach kids without being able to acknowledge queerness in the world, queerness in stories, the themes, the subtext, like just. And as someone who's teaching, do you feel a sense of not being able to do this, or are you feeling yourself more hesitant? Like where is your feeling now?
We just got an email the other day from the superintendent about some ridiculous political thing that some idiot was trying to push is trying to push about. Mostly it's focusing on trans kids and non-binary kids. And when I did what was called Little Women last year and is now called Finding Joe March, I wrote it specifically for my queer and non-binary kids because I have a ton of them. uh, I teach all about Eve, and you can't teach all about Eve without acknowledging the fact that Eve Harrington and Addison DeWitt are gay, gay, gay. you, you can't. Um, so yeah, no one pays a lot of attention to me. No one
Let's hope it
checks
stays
on
that way.
me.
Yes.
Yeah, so and my principal trusts that I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. So I guess it's one of those wait and see kind of things. I do when I hand out my All About Eve study guide. It talks about queer coding. It talks about what sort of the state of the queer identity was in 1950 America, and then what Stonewall riots were, and how post World War II, all these walls started falling down for all these different kinds of people. So I do talk about this stuff, and I just don't worry about it. Um, and I guess if someone tells me not to, I'll see what I do.
Yeah, because certain things like because certain stories like Peace Dorian Gray is overtly queer in certain ways, but it's interesting is that the way certain people think is queer is not necessarily like, oh well, they smoke cigarettes and are go to the opera. And it's like, well, people are cultured of all sexual identities, but the part where they, are obviously in love is kind of queer. But and but all about Eve is so it again, as we're saying about subtext and code, it's so there. I mean, Addison's final speech at the end, kind of like the fact that I'd want you at all seems improbable. I mean, they're very
Right.
clearly stated, but it ends like there is no way. There's no explanation. There's no other explanation for Eve's actions at the end of the play other than sexual desire.
She's gonna
There's no,
TV to LA and they're gonna be girlfriends for a
there's
long
no,
time.
but yeah, I mean, there's no. How would you get? How would you narratively get this character that we've seen as so well established, as so self-centered and self-obsessed to say, "Oh, come on in and let me help you,"
When
but
you watch Ann Baxter go, like you watch her do it.
oh
It's
yeah.
not even really subtle.
Well, I think there was a wonderful scene in Celluloid Closet where Gore Vidal is talking about having added a gay theme to I think he's a Spartacus, and
Mhm.
like don't tell Chuck Heston, he won't be able to understand it. But they asked the other guy, just play it this way, and he just showed a clip, but it's obviously being played there. So they're in a romantic scene, and Heston is
Poor
completely
dumb
unaware,
Charlton Heston.
giving his best performance as a um and it's really cool because it's the sort of like what is the riff, it makes more sense if there's some romantic and that's what leads to the riff. It doesn't make any other sense otherwise. So this stuff has always been there, and you're depriving your students or depriving kids of this by you're pretending it doesn't exist, or pretending that just queer identity is somehow more controversial or more quote unquote adult than I mean, because it could be no more overtly sexual or overtly romantic than The Great Gatsby. But like trying to teach a Great Gatsby without saying, okay, well, don't talk about the fact that Gatsby loves Daisy.
Mhm.
That would be awkward. Well, how do you teach this book? And how do you teach? Well, maybe there's been theories about Nick's sexuality or Nick's actions or whatever. It's just people exist in the world, right? Like why? It's just
Kids. I mean,
it's
they're
their
they're
time.
coming out in they're coming out now. They feel they have models, they have representation, they see themselves in fiction and TV shows and movies, and they see someone that looks like them and they say, "Oh, that's me," or "I feel that and I can be more comfortable um expressing myself." I mean,
Yeah.
it's there and it's not going away. I
But and
mean,
unfortunately, do you think that that's what they oppose? They really want these, because as we were kind of somewhat joking about the fans who wanted their version, they were much happier with Jonathan Frid as a lonely
mhm,
man whose best friend was his mother, rather than the fact that he's gay. It's like, and didn't talk about it because it was illegal at the time.
yeah.
So yes, and it just, well, we don't like the kids are coming out, even though it's no more accelerated about their sexual orientation than any
Right.
heterosexual kid. But we don't like that. We don't like that they feel uncomfortable. We don't like that they're seeing models of how to live as a queer person, because I'm
Well,
sure
and here's the
decades
thing.
ago there wouldn't exist.
Here's the thing is that people die. And all of these people who most of them, I think a lot of them are older and very white. And I think that soon they will be dead. And when they are dead, I mean, these kids are going to take over. I mean, white racists can't live forever. They can pass their ideology down, but I think it gets diluted, and I think that this new crop of kids, these kids that are teenagers now, I think that there are going to be more and more and more and more and more of them, and they're going to take over someday. I mean,
Yeah.
look at how much has changed. I mean, when I came out in 1994, it in this town, in this high school, there was one out gay kid per class. So I was the freshman, there was a sophomore, there was a junior, and there was a senior. I was the one. Even in my, this is so ridiculous, even in my theater department, my theater class here at the University of Montana, I was like the only out gay guy for a really long time, which was so weird in retrospect. But that was only 20 years ago. It wasn't that long ago, and so much has changed. My husband and I will watch, like, we're doing our semi-annual 30 Rock rewatch, and it gets harder and harder every time because it's receding into the past, and depictions of race, depictions of sexual orientation are so offensive. They're so
Mhm.
offensive. It wasn't that long ago.
Oh
It
yeah.
wasn't that long ago. The Simpsons, even. Um, from 5 years ago, does these things that I'm just going, wow, that's what you want to do, that's the joke you want to make,
Yeah.
okay.
And it just means how our perceptions of things have changed. What you find
So
funny
fast.
has changed. There's no you as a white kid in Montana or me as a black kid in South Carolina are not bad kids if we find a certain thing funny because we have no other reference of it. Oh
Right.
yeah, like the sissy is funny. Of course we should find that funny. Or the sassy black lady is funny. Why have no other reference, right? And then you start to get those references in as you experience the world and you're like, well, I don't find this funny, not because I'm overly woke or I'm actually making a political statement. I literally am not laughing. I'm not restraining the laughter. I'm literally not like, oh, well, Soap Dish is a film I really enjoyed when I was
Oh,
in high school. And it's like, oh my
yeah.
God, like that's a really horrible thing you do at the end to a trans Whoopi, I love you.
Whoopee.
How could you?
Whoopee.
And
Can we have
yeah,
that as shirt? Can we have a shirt that says Whoopee?
I
How
feel
could
like
you?
so it's so offensive it does not deserve a spoiler warning. So the end of Soap Dish, it basically ends with the villain being outed and essentially humiliated publicly as a trans person, dead named repeatedly, and like pictures of her pre-transition are shown, and it's meant to be, and of course, leading to the Robert Downey Jr.'s character who been involved with her being horrified and embarrassed. Yes,
Yeah,
it's
wanting to
constantly,
vomit. Yeah.
and it's just not funny. It's okay to admit that you find it funny. It's okay to admit that you might have found a fast, sassy black something in 30 Rock that doesn't age well, that you found it funny the first time. Don't beat yourself up over
Yeah.
it. It's just
And how
you
tired are
change.
you of being the butt of the joke? Like, that's what I keep thinking is I tell my students all the time, like, okay, so who is the story? Who wrote the story and who's the intended audience? Like, who is
Mhm.
that? And so often I have felt excluded, uh, or the butt of the joke. And The Simpsons, especially, like the gay characters often. And I was looking at Smithers and Mr. Burns the other day, and they've tried to do some reparative stuff recently, but it's like, well, the joke is that this lonely gay guy is obsessed with his boss, his old, and here's some fun ageism, his old boss. And I was like, it would be really interesting if Mr. Burns was like bisexual or pansexual or omnisexual or something, but just didn't want Smithers. Like, then I can see, like, okay, that could be interesting, or that could
Yeah,
be
it's
funny.
just
Like, it isn't.
he has a crush on me and I'm not
Yes.
interested. But
Yes.
and that it's intriguing. But yes, it's like, but it's okay. The stuff ages. I mean, The Simpsons had that challenge because it was inherently static, right? So then it was like these
Oh,
characters
right.
exist, even though you know when early Simpsons, Bart Simpson's your age, right? Like if you
Yes,
age in real
we are.
time,
Bart and I are the same age.
so if it aged in real time,
Oh,
you couldn't keep the show on, or you'd have to do something drastically different because now he's a
right.
he's a father of his own kids or whatever. So but now he sort of changes. I mean, it happened with Homer and Marge, or now they would be like, well, this woke feminist doesn't get The Simpsons. Like, well, now it's kind of like a woman who's under 30 watches this and she's like, but Marge is smarter than, why is this her life?
Yeah.
Like if she'd worked she'd probably be competent at a nuclear power plant. They would have gotten she would have gotten a promotion by now. She should be working, except he can't do any of the stuff at house. He's useless. I don't
When it's
I
interesting
don't
what they
connect
allow
with
to
it.
change, or when they allow the status quo to change, like they let Apu get married, and then Manjula comes back, and they allow them to have octuplets, and then the octuplets are referenced. But I mean, Ryan and I, my husband Ryan and I, we like to like look for these recurring episode remakes over and over again, and like these tropes. And one of them is Marge gets a job. And then Marge gets a job and she's good at it. And then by the end of the episode, they have to find a way to strip her of this job because she's got to be status quo
Mhm.
wise the stay-at-home mom. And yeah, even 30 years ago, I feel like that was maybe like,
It
really?
was
Like,
satirizing. It was satirizing a sort of some, but even that world, because now it would be sort of like the middle. She'd have to have a job
mhm.
because you're a two
You can't
income family.
support three kids in a giant house and your decrepit father and keep him in the home
Yeah.
on one, however much, I don't know what a nuclear excuse me, not scientist,
Well, he has a high
nuclear
school. Yeah, he's
can
got a high
make.
school degree, so I think uh diploma. It's not ever called, but yeah, it's the compelling. But I think the art changes and it grows, and I feel like that's
Mhm.
the thing that is the pushback. And taking it back to again what you do, the folks who are kind of like, oh, we can't look any evaluation of the founders that are different, and looking at people who own slaves or are terrible is different. We can't try to put it in context, or also say, well, the context is still bad because you're looking at it from there. Would you have liked to have been a slave? Because being a slave is bad, so you would probably not like, if you're looking at it from the context of the enslaved, these are always bad people. My wife and I will always like to watch, Finding Your Roots, and when the white actor never really discovers they have like a slave owner in the past, is kind of like, oh, they feel awkward and embarrassed about it, and then have the black actor who sees the figure of someone who owned their ancestors, and it was essentially and it's a different confrontation, right? It's which is human. You're looking at a guy in your past who you don't really feel that connected to, who did horrible things. And it's easier to say, okay, well, he did this horrible stuff, but he also was the first one to open this plant. That's cool. But then if not, you're hearing the stories of awful things that happened to your relatives and your family, and you're looking at the eyes of that monster in that world. And that's kind of it. But it's about storytelling, right? That someone, as you tell stories. Who's the butt of the joke? Who's the
Mhm.
story? Who the person we're watching? Um, I think Dark Shadows, to bring that back, did very well of like, oh, well, actually the monsters are more interesting. So we're going to
Oh
look at
yeah.
the world
Oh
through the
yeah.
monsters'
When the
eyes.
Vampire Diaries came out, I remember I watched like the first couple of seasons and I kind of gave up on it, but it reminded me very much of the 91 Dark Shadow series where we can't let the normal people know. Like the present time characters in Dark Shadows can never find out that Barnabas is a vampire. And as problematic and stupid as the Tim Burton movie is, I really liked that Elizabeth was in on the secret. It made her more interesting. Like she gets to know and gets to hold on to this. And but the fact that we can't let any of the present time characters become savvy weakens them and makes them look stupid. And that would never fly today. I mean, I know
Yeah.
that so many people
But
want
it's not like a horrible secret though, and I don't know if
right.
that is itself queer coding, and that even Burton wasn't deliberately doing it, but it was kind of like his Barnabas was like, "I'm out. This is who I am," and everyone's fine with it.
Look
Why
at
would
my
I?
fingers.
Yeah, like why would I go? Especially with sort of and the idea that he never saw the guy during the daytime, but it was sort of an almost like he was sort of everyone just sort of didn't want to talk about the fact
Hmm.
maybe they sort of knew but didn't want to talk about his weirdness. So I think that was sort of now it's like, well, we don't. They do this in TV shows now where there are a lot of the unfortunately folks our age, men our age, are like, oh, I don't like that the Flash's wife knows his identity, or Superman's wife knows his identity. It should be this He-Man woman haters club, but he don't know. It's like, well, no, the secret identity is not about like, oh, if anyone knew the secret about myself, if my like literally with Spider-Man, if my aunt knew the secret, my lovely aunt, if she ever found out what I truly am, she'd have a heart attack and die.
And die.
It's not
Well,
what
audiences, people
we're
don't
not
seem to
doing
realize
that
that
now.
audiences become more sophisticated. I was talking about this with my classes the other day. I was like, if I showed you guys the 1931 Dracula, you would fall asleep. Can you imagine, like, most 14-year-olds, they'd be like, what is this? Why are you even showing us this? Like, atmosphere, atmosphere, Bela Lugosi. And they'd be like, and I was like, but people seemed legitimately scared of that 91 years ago. audiences are sophisticated and we've moved beyond this. And I think that that's why it's hard a lot of times, and why Dark Shadows became the monster show, because they were the more interesting characters, and kids in the 60s were identifying with these characters more than just the straight-laced, governess and cousins who can't be let into the secret. Kids wanted to be
Absolutely.
let in on they wanted to be the secret. They wanted to be the monsters.
Yeah. And I think to the extent that if there's queer kids identifying with Spider-Man now, they see, oh, well, my cool aunt is played by Marissa Tomei, and will be like, oh yeah, you should have told me before, but I'm cool, and this is great.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a better message now. Um, Thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me and telling me what you're working on. And in a weird way, you made me feel very optimistic about what's happening. About what's happening in the schools, and I'm glad that you are
I'm
connected
lucky.
with it and everything.
I'm a lucky guy. I don't want to say that. I cannot say that enough. Like, I'm really fortunate to be where I am doing what I do. Other people are not so lucky or not so fortunate,
Yeah.
which is why we're having this conversation.
Yeah. So everyone, please go vote. Go make sure that people can keep their jobs, can teach kids and be themselves, and teach kids the truth, and make them better people, I believe. Uh, Laramie Dean, delight to chat with you. Once again, can you tell folks your book that's coming out?
Yes, I'll show you once again, because here it remains on my phone. Can I figure this out? Oh, this way. Yeah, so this is, oh gosh, this is Black Forest. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on Barnes and Noble. It's on Target too. When I saw it was on Target.com,
Everywhere.
I freaked out a little bit. I was like, "Oh, yeah!" So it comes out November 1st. If you are a Dark Shadows fan, I think you'll like this. I think I actually name checked Dark Shadows at some point. Incongruously, my main character might be watching Dark Shadows episodes in his dorm room.
It happens. It was in the 90s. That was me. I did it. I based some of my classes around it. So thank you again, Laramie. Thanks, everyone. We'll chat with you.